Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You tuned into India Tonight with me, Sumita Karir, and my lovely co-host Nivedana Prabhu. We're joining you live from our Delhi studios. And tonight, the big story is all about Donald Trump's tariff bomb, which has been dropped on India. President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on goods that are imported from India. That's effective August 1. That, along with an additional penalty for India's purchase of Russian energy and military equipment. In fact, he announced that via a Truth Social post. The president cited India's high tariffs and stringent non-monetary trade barriers as reasons for the move, stating, and I quote, "We have done relatively little business with them because the tariffs are far too high, amongst the highest in the world." Nivedana, that's essentially what President Donald Trump has stated, but he's also criticized the fact that India still continues to buy energy from Russia.
Absolutely, Sumita. In fact, on a lighter note, you did call me a lovely co-host, but these numbers not looking so lovely, which we'll deep dive into in a bit. But like you mentioned, with the fact that Trump also criticized India's trade with Russia, particularly amidst global calls to end the conflict in Ukraine. So this decision, in fact, comes as trade talks between the US and India remains unresolved, with sticking points around agriculture and dairy sectors. Indian officials suggest the tariffs may be temporary as negotiations, remember, continue with the US delegation expected in Delhi by late August. Now, we, of course, will bring you expert analysis on what this means for India's economy and global trade. But before we do that with our experts, let's listen in to what ET Now's consulting editor, Swaminathan Iyer, had to say on Trump's 25% tariffs.
There were many people who earlier said, let us be very accommodative. Let us give in to Trump as far. Let's not get into a retaliation game with him. For instance, one thing that we did, we gave up the Google tax without anything in return, just to try and mollify the man in advance. Now, if we see between our approach and China's approach, that China said, I'm absolutely going to stand up to you. I think the Chinese approach ultimately turns out to be better. If you stand up to Trump, you're going to get a better deal. If you just give in to begin with, he sees a weakness. He sees that India just doesn't have that many cards in this particular game, and he's going to slap you with whatever he wants.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that was Swami Sir weighing in on what this 25% tariff and, of course, an additional penalty could mean for the Indian economy. And of course, it doesn't bode well for the Indian economy and of course the diverse sectors in the longer run. But a crucial update that's coming in from the government of India, that Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar, they are meeting. The meeting is currently underway in Parliament premises. My colleague in Times Network's Rishabh Pratap, who covers MEA extensively for the network, is joining us live with more details. Rishabh, what are you picking up so far as this meeting between the Commerce Minister and the External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar is concerned? What is India likely to do next?
Well, Samita, what we're given to understand that we are not going to have a straightforward answer right now to the tariff that has been slapped on us. What we're given to understand that we will go ahead with a wait and watch strategy, and we'll try and go ahead with the mutually agreed bilateral trade agreement is what many within government of India suggest. Also, what we are given to understand that next 48 hours is going to be very crucial. Yes, there has been a tweet, there's a confirmation that has from the United States President, but India right now is looking at a long-term trade deal. And both of us know, Samita, that the team from US is coming to India in later half of August for the first tranche of BTA to take forward the TOR that has been discussed in the first round of meetings earlier this year. So India would focus on that, is what we are given to understand. But an immediate response from government of India is not expected on this. Many suggest that yes, this is coming, but it would be better in India's interest to see through it and try and get out of it as of now. So we'll have to wait. The meeting between the two ministers continue within the parliament premises. What comes out of that meeting is something that would be very interesting. Also, in practice, we have External Affairs Ministry's press conference tomorrow. That is Thursday. So what officially India's spokesperson Randeep Jaiswal says will also be very, very important.
Absolutely, Rishabh. I appreciate putting in that context for us as to what we're picking up at the moment, but what is that going to look like? Well, only time's going to tell. Having said that, we leave the conversation at that, but taking the opportunity to also introduce our special guest joining us this evening. Let me begin with the fact that Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador and representative of India WTO, joins us, as well as Anup Madhavan, former Commerce Secretary. Good evening to the both of you. Thank you very much for taking the time out. Sumita, clearly a lot to be talking about given the aspect of what we're looking at here. If you would want to take that across to Anup.
Right, Nivedna. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on ET. Now, let me come to you, Mr. Vadhavan, given the fact that you have served in the Commerce Department earlier and, of course, have gone through very many trade deals with a diverse set of countries. Is this 25% tariff plus the penalty that Donald Trump has stated? There is no clarity on what that penalty is going to be. Is that amount going to be over and above the 10% baseline tariff, which is currently going on? And what kind blow does this really give to India's industry and economy as a whole?
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me. It's somewhat unclear, but my impression is that this will not be over and above the 10%, but this will be the applicable duty rate at 25%. And as you mentioned, the penalty amount is not clarified yet. And there's very little notice period, so to say. I think today is 30th of July and day after tomorrow is 1st August, and they come into force without the penalty having been specified. So it's very uncertain, and without the space and time for diplomatic options to be further explored, especially when, things were ongoing as part of that bilateral trade negotiation. So it's somewhat surprising and, of course, very unfair and violative of WTO law. But my understanding is that this will not be over and above 10%, but it will replace the 10%. And in terms of impact, I'm not overly concerned. You have to see the 25% relative to what other countries are facing in the first instance. So I think most countries will end up with at least 10%, and the major trading partners of the US like Japan, Vietnam, they're all facing, 15 to 20% duties, EU also 15%. So 25 by itself is not something we should be overly concerned with, and our exporters will adjust. To some extent, they'll perhaps absorb part of the tariff, and the American buyer will absorb part of the tariff. I don't think it'll be trade stopping, especially since other countries are facing broadly similar levels. The penalty amount, of course, is uncertain, so I don't know what that is going to be. But in the worst case, even if the duties are at a trade stopping level, we have to see our trade with America in the context of a $3 trillion economy. And I don't think 70, 80 billion export volume to the US and a 30, 40 billion trade surplus is going to be really shattering. Yeah. So it's not something I'm overly concerned
sir. I
with.
want to. Right, sir. But at this point in time, are these tariffs tenable because they require congressional approval? These are secondary tariffs, and we already know that the 10% baseline tariff is already being, there's been court hearings on that as well. So is this tenable? Will these be immediately applicable from August 1?
I think legality is something President Trump is stressing very much. Legality in terms of international law and legality in terms of U.S. law. And if you see Professor Krugman's recent statements, he has mentioned that these tariffs are illegal both under international law and U.S. law. But I don't think anyone is paying too much heed to legality in the U.S. government at this time. So I don't think that is going to be an immediate issue. Down the road, the courts may decide that these are illegal, it has to go to Congress, get congressional sanction, but that is somewhat distant in the future. Right now, of course, we have an immediate issue. The gap between the announcement and the imposition date is very small. It leaves little room for further negotiations, which should be the logical step. But otherwise, as I mentioned, in pure economic terms, it seems very alarming, and it is somewhat shocking to hear this announcement. But then, in real, if we truly analyze, it is not going to be earth-shattering and the heavens won't fall, and our exporters will adjust. And as I mentioned elsewhere, also to the extent President Trump does it to a large number of countries, he'll just carve America out of, global economic flows. The world will carve itself around the U.S. and our exporters, export not just to the U.S., they export to other countries also. They will divert their energies to other countries and trade volumes will grow elsewhere. The whole world will adjust around the U.S. So I'm not overly concerned about the economic impact. In the worst case, let us say he imposes a penalty duty that is, trade stopping. And then we, of course, have the option to retaliate. We must exercise those options. And we should retaliate, effectively where the impact is the most. And we have to include services, in that retaliation. All the American digital businesses, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the WhatsApps, the Googles, they earn billions of dollars in India, and that has not been, brought into the calculus by President Trump. He disregards our procurement of oil. He disregards our procurement of defense equipment. He disregards all this services, business income of American companies, and takes a very partial view on the trade, goods trade, merchandise trade deficit, and has taken these, unilateral, international, illegal under international law actions. And so we must, set that calculus right. And in our retaliation, which we will ultimately have to exercise if, better sense does not prevail, if diplomatic actions don't lead to better outcomes, then we must also retaliate against American services business in India, and impose taxes on them. And I think European Union was threatening to impose those.
Right.
Canada has been threatening to impose those.
Yeah. So will we essentially look at that, and is that how it's going to be played out now? It remains to be seen. But I request you to stay with us. I'm going to come back to you. But before I do that, let's also listen into Times Network's consulting editor, Shinjoy Chowdhury, who gets us more inputs as to what we're picking up in this given situation.
Donald Trump is making it very clear that India may be a friend, but will have to pay 25% tariff and more because of its relationship with Russia, for buying Russian arms for all these years, and now buying Russian oil while the war with Ukraine is continuing. Now, this is a huge penalty, and we will have to see what the president says tomorrow, or maybe the day after, because we have often seen that the president has made statements, very pugnacious statements, and then gone back on them. So we don't know whether this is the bottom line or whether it's a first throw of the dice. So also we have to keep in mind the fact that there will be an American delegation that will be here very soon. So what will they say at that point? So all of this is still up in the air. We will have to see which President Trump actually gets to the Oval Office tomorrow or the day after. Because with the president, it's very difficult to say what the bottom line is going to be at this point. Nevertheless, it's a very important statement, and this is something which will worry India.
Right, indeed. It remains to be seen what the government reaction this is going to be, and of course India's strategy on this massive announcement that is coming from the United States. Coming back to you, Mr. Vidhavan. Now, India so far has maintained a strategy of not escalating, these tariff negotiations. We haven't really hit out at the United States as we have seen happen from many other countries. But what are the next possible steps that India could take from here on, and how should India respond, particularly with respect to this announcement that has come? Because this is an announcement that is going to have severe ramifications. If you compare the April level tariffs, which were essentially at 26%, then it came to 10%, and now it's going to be exceeding that cumulative figure.
Right. As was just mentioned, there's an element of extreme uncertainty, and of course, President Trump remains unpredictable. He's declared that they'll come into force on 1st August, but the penalty amount has not been, determined or announced. So whether he is going to actually, bring them into force on 1st August, or like he did for China, based on negotiations and discussions, he extended that deadline. It remains to be seen. I would certainly feel that there is a fair chance that the U.S. is not in a position to actually implement these duties from 1st August. And for various reasons, including, diplomatic discussions which are ongoing, they may decide to, extend the date beyond 1st August, especially since the U.S. delegation, which is supposed to come in August. So this announcement is very confusing. And given, past behavior on part of President Trump and the U.S., it remains to be seen whether they come into force on 1st August. My suspicion is that there is a fair chance that this date gets extended beyond 1st August and further discussions happen. So this might be sort of posturing on President Trump's side to convey a message, that some sensitivities on which India might be very adamant and determined. He might be putting pressure to, alleviate some of those issues. So it remains to be seen. But then beyond the point, if they do come into force on 1st, then certainly India must explore its, retaliation options. We can't just take it lying down. We are also a democracy. We have a political economy which is highly contested and highly aware. And we have to then take our logical options and put them into play in terms of, retaliation. Under the WTO rules, this is nothing, very untoward or improper. It is all envisaged under the WTO rules which Mr. Trump is violating. And I hope it doesn't come to that, but ultimately we have to resort to those measures. And my view also is that ultimately the U.S. will harm itself, as I mentioned just now. They'll carve themselves out of global economic flows. The U.S. share of global GDP has been shrinking. It was 50% after World War II. It is now 25%. It will keep shrinking. And what President Trump will do is he'll accelerate that shrinkage by creating a high tariff, wall around the U.S., which will divert economic flows to the rest of the world. And that is what India will do. Ultimately, we have to live with these tariffs. We will do our retaliation. It will cause avoidable pain to American entities, to American citizens. But then life will go on, and, our exporters will find other destinations for their exports. So I am not overly concerned. We must, of course, try to find a diplomatic solution, try to, make some sense prevail in this whole business, which at this moment makes no sense at all. And hopefully, that sense will prevail. But if it doesn't, then we have to exercise our options and live with this. And I'm sure the heavens won't fall. In economic terms, that impact will be very bearable for a large economy like India. And the ultimate sufferer will be the U.S., especially if they repeat this story with, most countries, as they seem inclined to do. Because, they've ended up with 15% duties on EU, 15% on Japan, for 20% and 40% on Vietnam. So ultimately the U.S. will just shrink its economic size and its, economic role in the world. That is what is going to ultimately.
Right, Mr. Vadhavan. I appreciate you putting that into context as to how you're looking at this. But essentially, of course, we'll have to wait and watch as to how India responds to that, and moreover, what the final negotiations is going to look like. But thank you very much for taking the time out and joining us here.